Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. What do we make of Ash Wednesday in a year like this? Since last March, we've all become acutely aware of the tenuousness of life, the fact that we're all vulnerable. It's as if we've been walking around with ashes on our forehead all year. Every person wearing a mask, the accumulating mountains of statistics and color-coded maps, they all remind us of just how fragile life can be. Those reminders are inescapable. Yet, while the topography of this year may look different than anything we've traversed before, mortality has always been our landscape. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. None of us has ever known the hour we would die or how. And I've found myself vacillating in response to the world that we live in between these poles of complacency and despair, resigned to the way things are or bemoaning the fact that they are not what they once were. And in that, the monotony of the day-to-day can at times feel overwhelming. My world narrowed to the confines of my apartment and carefully navigated journeys into public. It's been difficult to maintain perspective, to see beyond the tallies of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. And yet, I think that's where Ash Wednesday has something to say to us. By confronting us with our own mortality, the tenuousness of our lives, Ash Wednesday challenges us to look beyond ourselves, beyond our own human limits, and to turn towards God. And through God, to turn towards one another and seek the healing of our world. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That stark reminder that none of us will live forever raises the question of what gives our life meaning. How do we make the most of the limited time that we have on this earth? That question is at the heart of our readings today. In Isaiah, we encounter the people of Israel returning from exile in Babylon. They've witnessed the fracture of their community, the pain of separation from their homeland, the destruction of their temple at the hands of an invader. Death and destruction are the land they've inhabited. We hear how the people of Israel are trying to regain God's favor, and with it, a former way of life. They've taken to public displays of penance and piety. They've bowed their heads like a bulrush and lain in sackcloth and ashes. They're trying to prove their righteousness to themselves, to one another, and to God. And then, in Matthew's gospel, we hear a similar challenge that he issues to his contemporaries. He warns them against acts of religious devotion that are first and foremost about being seen. He warns them against acts that make piety into performance and charity into self-promotion. The temptation that we hear called out by both Isaiah and Jesus in Matthew's gospel is against those who use religion and charity as a way to bolster their own self-worth, instead of doing the necessary self-examination and ordering of their life in ways that God desires for them to. I think of the ways that I have fallen into those same traps. Those times when I was content to receive ashes on my forehead, but not willing to change anything about my life. Those times when I marched with those speaking up against police and racialized violence, but never acknowledge how I myself have benefited from the systems that created that violence. I think of times when I spoke out about injustice or economic inequality, but was unwilling to part with any of the bills in my wallet. Think of those times when I expressed outrage over injustices against Native people or the separation of families at our southern border, but that I let that rage fizzle out as I continued on in my day-to-day life. I think of those times when I wanted to be on the right side of an issue, but didn't want to transform that position into any kind of meaningful action. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Isaiah reminds the people of Israel that God didn't bring them out of exile for them to just work to garner favor in God's eyes. God didn't deliver them from their captors for them to seem holy without changing anything in their lives. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Isaiah calls his people to turn towards God, to leave behind their desire to seem righteous, and to start living in accord with God's desires. And that turn towards God demands a turn towards their neighbors, towards one another, to see beyond their own needs and to see the needs of the community, to desire not their own freedom, but the freedom of everyone. What God desires is not a life of performative piety, but a substantive life of love, in which each of God's chosen people cares for the community as a whole and sees the needs of those who suffer. I think that is, in part, also what Matthew is talking about in his gospel. From all the talk of almsgiving to the admonition to store up treasure in heaven rather than on earth, Jesus calls his followers away from the appearance of holiness and towards a life in God that demands living for one another. God doesn't desire elaborate rituals or having the right words to pray, but a life that is lived wholly and fully in love. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We hear those words every Ash Wednesday, not as a call to prove ourselves before God and one another, to seem holy, pious, good, and righteous, but as a reminder to focus on what gives our life shape and meaning. That reminder of the fragility of our lives, especially in a year when that has been on full display, is an invitation to turn towards God and towards one another. It's an invitation to reorient ourselves in the brief time that we have on this earth and to be vehicles for God's love to come into the world. Those words, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return, are a call to action. They're a call to be what we hear about in the book of Isaiah, to be repairers of the breach, the restorers of streets to live in. I wish I could stand here and tell you what that looks like, what it means to loose the bonds of injustice in our own day. But no series of a few points at the end of a sermon can do that. What the prophet Isaiah and Jesus calls us to is a reorientation of our whole selves towards God, towards one another, towards our neighbor, towards everyone that we meet over the course of a day, week, month, year, over the entirety of our lives. What God calls us to is to seek justice and healing in a broken world, and to come alongside those who are already doing that work. Unpacking what all of this means for us here, now, today, is the work of Lent, the work of our whole journey of faith and life with Christ. I pray that we may use this Lenten season, a Lent that will look like unlike any other, that we may use it to be a time of exploration, a time to wrestle with what the prophet's invitation means for us, and a time to realize renewed meaning in the face of our own vulnerability. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return.